Hello, my name is Jason Samosa, and welcome to Jason Samosa's Ufology Moment. This is part 3 of a multi-part series on the Clintons, John Podesta, and UFO disclosure. Ultimately, I want to know, why did Podesta and Clinton feel it was okay to take an unnecessary risk and weave the UFO issue into their campaign in 2016? My thesis is that they had a reason that goes beyond simply wanting to talk about UFOs. And in today's final episode, I want to find that reason. So, without further delay, let's get started. Let's pick up where we left off in part 2 of this series. When the Second Air Force report on Roswell was released in 1997, the Clinton push for UFO disclosure went quiet, which is all the more strange given the blockbuster UFO events that occurred that year, with both the Phoenix Lights and the Admiral Tom Wilson events occurring in 97. Instead of UFOs, the second Clinton term was dominated by the Lewinsky scandal, and by the time the second term was finished, nothing new had come. Not even a last-ditch effort to push for disclosure before he left. Podesta and Clinton had clearly decided to stop pushing for disclosure. I wonder what you think the reason was. Perhaps they got busy, perhaps they just got exhausted by the stonewalling. Or what if they were warned? Based on everything we know about the history of UFO secrecy, I would lean towards the latter explanation. Especially since the Phoenix Lights represented not only the ideal moment to open the discussion, but it was also perfectly timed with Podesta and Clinton having just spent 4 years secretly working away on the UFO disclosure issue in the background. And despite the Phoenix Light offering this perfect culmination and such a large-scale event, in fact, the biggest UFO event, I think, in American history in terms of witnesses, they didn't go for it. 97 turned to 98, which turned to 99 and 2000, and as 2001 began, the Clintons were out and George Bush was in. So what happened next? For a year or so, there is nothing worth mentioning. But then, in late 2002, we get our first proper glimpse at Podesta in public disclosure mode. On the 22nd of October 2002, Podesta joined journalist Leslie Keane and a few others at the National Press Club for an event focused on UFO disclosure. On the stage, Podesta said,
"The notion of open government, freedom of information, the fundamental tenets of the Freedom of Information Act are really part and parcel of our First Amendment rights. I think it's time to open the books on questions that have remained in the dark, on the question of government investigations of UFOs. It's time to find out what the truth really is that's out there. We ought to do it really because it's right. We ought to do it because the American people, quite frankly, can handle the truth. And we ought to do it because it's the law." So there are these cases in which documents haven't been made available to the American public. The American public, as Bonnie noted, is quite skeptical about the fact that the government won't make them available for public inspection. These are records that are more than 25 years old. They ought to be declassified, they ought to be released, and we ought to be able to see for ourselves what's included in those documents.
Podesta, now freed from his public responsibilities, seems completely unafraid to put his name next to the UFO issue. It's 2002. UFO stigma is still rampant, and he was, until recently, the chief aide to the president. And he's coming out here to support UFO disclosure. And isn't it interesting to see him once again bringing up the Air Force in his statements? Clearly, he had not forgotten the stonewalling that he and Clinton had experienced over the Roswell report. Now, it's one thing to participate in an event, but it's another to organize one yourself. And just a few weeks later, that's exactly what Podesta would do. According to the journals of Jacques Vallée, Forbidden Science Volume 5, page 169, if you want to see it. And by the way, all references and links will be in the description. In early November 2002, Podesta's lobbying firm, Podesta Mattoon, which was run together with Republican Dan Mattoon, hosted a panel on UFOs with quite the roster. There was, of course, John Podesta with Leslie Kean, a partnership which we shall see was just in its infancy at this point. By this point, it had been 3 years since Leslie Kean had written an article for the Boston Globe about the Admiral Wilson leaks that we discussed in the previous episode, which highlights even further that Podesta absolutely would have been in the loop on this issue. We also see Henry Diamond, one of Lawrence Rockefeller's close associates. 2 others from the Rockefeller Initiative are also present, Jacques Vallée and Ed Rothschild. And you also have Bernie Haish from Lockheed Martin, someone who has since got on the record about the reality of secret reverse engineering programs. There's also Paul Davids, the guy who wrote the book that Hillary Clinton was seen holding in the photo with Lawrence Rockefeller, if you remember from the previous episode. And also Michio Kaku, someone who seems to have been involved in the UFO dialogue for far longer than many realize. We don't know what was discussed at this panel. Vallée's journals don't give us that detail, but we do draw some important conclusions from the event. Podesta was willing to put his face out there in support of UFO disclosure, but he was also willing to use his own lobbying company, which was co-run with another politician, to support discussions around UFO disclosure. As well as this, Podesta felt it was worth inviting old contacts from the Rockefeller Initiative, which shows that this isn't just a one-way relationship as some people have liked to position it. Indeed, Podesta actually reaches out to them to pull them into the UFO dialogue as well. But as well as this, he was also building a broader set of connections than those he'd had in the 90s. Essentially, between this panel and his part in the 2002 National Press Club, Podesta had quickly found himself looped in with the most prominent UFO disclosure activists of the era. Very interesting. But what would happen next wasn't just constrained to private meetings. Not long after these 2 meetings, Podesta would find himself locked in a very public conflict over UFO secrecy, this time with NASA. On the 9th of December, 1965, a strange object crashed in Kecksburg, Pennsylvania. As residents were finishing the working day, at 4:30 p.m., they saw the skies torn in two by a roaring fireball ripping through the sky. In fact, they were not the only ones who claimed to have seen this. The object seems to have been falling for quite a while and burning very brightly, with witnesses seeing it across multiple states, including Wisconsin, Michigan, Indiana, Ohio, West Virginia, and even north of the American border in Ontario. As well as this, 23 pilots claimed to have seen the object, and a seismograph also recorded shockwaves caused by the object. But it was in Kecksburg that residents not only saw it, but they also heard and felt it, as a metallic acorn-shaped craft hit the earth in local woodland. And an interesting tidbit, it had, according to eyewitnesses, what appeared to be Egyptian-style hieroglyphics around its lower rim. Very interesting. From here, witnesses attest that the fire department arrived on the scene before the area around the site was secured by police. And not long after, a heavy military presence arrived. And when they left, whatever had landed in the forest was gone. The next day, local newspapers claimed a UFO had crashed and the military had taken it away. Although shortly after this, the story changed and authorities claimed it was just a meteor that had entirely disintegrated before reaching Earth. A fascinating tale that has some incredible parallels to Roswell. Now, if you're anything like me, this case is fascinating, but it's also a bit frustrating. The testimony of so many witnesses is compelling, and yet this event is now buried in the distant past. We can't touch the craft, we can't run our hands along the supposed hieroglyphics. We have no photograph of the truck carrying the device away. And without these things, no matter how curious the event is, how can we really be expected to feel the reality of it all? It's distant, and as such, even if it did happen, to the modern student, it can only feel mythical. But also, like many UFO cases, it's what happened after that starts to reveal the true color of the case. Like with the Phoenix Lights, it's one thing that thousands of people claim to see a giant V-shaped craft silently hover 100 foot over the city. That's very interesting. But it's another thing for Fife Symington, the governor of Arizona, who had previously mocked eyewitnesses for saying it was all nonsense, to later come out and say he saw it too, but he was encouraged to calm citizens. See, there's the event itself, which has its own set of evidence, and then there's this kind of cover-up behavior that follows it. And these are two different layers of evidence that come together to make a case especially compelling. It's the same with Roswell. It's one thing to have the newspaper headline and the eyewitness testimony from 1947, but it's another thing for Jesse Marcel Jr. to be told to pose with tin foil for a photo op, despite knowing that what crashed in the desert wasn't a weather balloon, or for the Air Force to leave out crucial eyewitness testimony in their review of the case, only to later include it in a third review when they were pushed. Once again, there's the evidence of the event itself, which is compelling, but it's the evidence of a cover-up that makes it even more compelling. Why would Adam and Eve cover their private parts if there wasn't anything to conceal? Why would the CIA and the United States Air Force cover up UFO incidents if there wasn't a there to hide? These responses reveal a tendency towards secrecy and cover-ups, which only serves to underscore the importance of these events. If nothing happened, what are you hiding? And once more, with the Kecksburg case, we see this pattern continue. Nearly 40 years later, NASA would start behaving as if it had something it was trying to hide about the case. And of all people, John Podesta was going to get involved. Not long after hosting the Podesta Mattoon panel on UFOs that we mentioned earlier, Leslie Kean decided to do a deep investigation of the Kecksburg case. And to this end, she would submit a FOIA request to NASA for documents related to the incident. She made her first FOIA request on January 31st, 2003, and 3 months later, she got a response saying there were no records. 1 month later, on the 9th of May 2003, she appealed this response and this time got more specific, listing a specific list of indexes that pointed to potentially relevant records in the National Archives. So she was giving them even more help at this point. But NASA didn't ever properly respond to the request. And so, as 2003 ended, Kean wrote to them, informing them she intended to sue. With legal activity on the agenda, NASA suddenly sent Kean a batch of documents. What are the odds? But they had clearly failed to fulfill the full search, missing a whole bunch of the search categories that had been requested. Essentially, it looked like they were doing the bare minimum in an attempt to fend off legal action. So, Kean now appealed again, and legal documents show that the senior attorney for NASA now sent instructions to the FOIA office to be forwarded to all NASA centers, directing them to perform the search as requested. Now, I spent a whole morning reading the legal documents around this third search, and honestly, it's really dense, complex, and it will take far too long to go through everything exhaustively, but suffice to say, NASA continued to stonewall. And so, finally, Kean got the courts involved. In 2006, NASA finally undertook a fourth search where they mysteriously found more documents. Well, they must have been really well hidden. Although, once more, it was clear that NASA were doing the bare minimum. Finally, After 3 years of legal action, the case reached a climax in March of 2007. Leslie Kean won, a full 4 years after her initial FOIA request. NASA were ordered to pay her legal fees, and the federal judge, Emmett Sullivan, angrily referred to NASA's search efforts as a, and I quote here, ball of yarn that never fully answered the request, adding, and I quote again, I can sense the plaintiff's frustration because I'm frustrated, end quote. Later that year, Kean started to receive batches of documents. Eventually, NASA claimed that 2 critical boxes on the Kecksburg case were missing. What a surprise. Once again, we have a case with good initial evidence that makes you curious, but a case that is made all the more fascinating by the awkward games and stonewalling. If there's nothing in the safe, why are you being so awkward about opening it? Now, what is fascinating for our purposes was that Podesta had publicly thrown his weight behind Kean's efforts. Of course, he didn't have any additional evidence to offer in this specific case, but as a key architect of FOIA expansions during the Clinton presidency, his voice was significant. In a 2003 interview with the New York Post, Podesta stated, I think it's fair to say we have truly entered the realm of science fiction in Washington, D.C., when it's fair game to disclose the identity of a clandestine CIA agent, but not the records of an unexpected crash in Kecksburg, Pennsylvania that happened 38 years ago. Now, I couldn't find out who this CIA agent was that Podesta was referring to, but you get the point. If the Kecksburg incident was really just a meteor that crashed 40 years ago at this point, why subject it to a higher level of secrecy than an active CIA agent who clearly had their name revealed because that wasn't a big deal? But yet the Kecksburg incident is, and it's just a meteor from 40 years ago. Nothing about this adds up, and that's what Podesta is emphasizing in his interview. Of course, we know the answer to Podesta's question, and Podesta did too. The answer, and we can say this with confidence, sometimes we fail to do this, but let's say what's really going on here. The answer is that something astonishing happened at Kecksburg, and whatever it is, NASA had decided they wouldn't share it. Interestingly, Ed Rothschild, who was at the previous Podesta Mattoon panel in late 2003, also got involved in the case, making public statements too. You can see that this coalition of activists was forming. What is especially interesting for our purposes is the public nature of Podesta's confrontation with NASA. Podesta is not just saying he is against secrecy. He is willing to put his name next to the most public confrontations between secrecy and disclosure. It's that same spirit we saw in the Clinton administration, where Clinton and Podesta pushed pretty relentlessly on the United States Air Force and the CIA. And now, in 2003, we see Podesta locking horns with NASA. I think it's fair to say this isn't just theater. This was a 4-year legal battle that was so compelling that they won, and we have the quotes from the judge and the legal documents. They beat NASA and showed that the FOIA legislation actually can be used to reverse unacceptable government secrecy. But I think also what is really important about this is it shows that this is genuine activism. This isn't just theater. This isn't just a game that's being played to deceive people in 2016, that the Clintons and Podesta are genuinely interested in UFO disclosure. Their interest goes back, and it's documented, and it's public, and it's confrontational, even going to a judge who ends up siding with Kean in this case. The success of this case was not the end of Kean and Podesta's partnership. In 2007, Leslie Kean co-organized another National Press Club event with the documentary filmmaker James Fox. They brought together a panel of people from around the world, and this included Fife Symington, who we've referenced quite a lot, the former Arizona governor who was the moderator, Ray Bowyer, captain of the Orangey Air Services from the Channel Islands, Rodrigo Bravo, captain and pilot for the Aviation Army of Chile, General Wilfred de Brouwer, former Deputy Chief of Staff from the Belgian Air Force, John Callahan, Chief of Accidents and Investigations for the FAA, Dr. Anthony Choi of the OIFAA and the Peruvian Air Force, Jean-Claude Dubuc, a captain for Air France, Charles Holt and Jim Penniston, two United States Air Force staff who you may recognize as being associated with the Rendlesham Forest incident, Nick Pope from the Ministry of Defense, General Parviz Jafari from the Iranian Air Force, Dr. Claude Pocher, founder of the French GEPAN, the UFO research organization, Dr. Jean-Claude Rib, Centre National de Recherche Scientifique France, and finally Oscar Santa Maria Huerta, a commander of the Peruvian Air Force. I must apologize if I've mispronounced or overpronunciated any of these names. You can only do your best. Now, all of these people together spoke about their UFO experiences in front of the world's biggest media outlets. It must have been undeniably impressive to even the most ardent skeptic. Here you have generals, pilots, PhD level academics, and commanders from all around the world. You have South and North America represented, Europe, and even the Middle East. At a time where the stigma surrounding UFOs was palpable, it turns out that there's still a way to move the conversation forward. You just need overwhelming credentials and evidence, and that is what this conference was all about. And by the way, for anyone who is happy about the disclosure process that's ramped up over the last few years, this panel was a big deal in getting us to where we are today. Not only in terms of making the subject credible, but also in putting pressure on the US government by showing that other countries were willing to be transparent. Because that means that even if the US was not willing to touch this issue, it was going to come out in some shape or form anyway. Because if these other countries are talking publicly and they're having investigations, that means that there really is a time limit on UFO disclosure. But what was also significant was that prior to the event, the heads of the agencies studying UFOs in Chile and France both wrote to John Podesta personally at the behest of Leslie Kean, explaining the need for the US to start taking action.
After returning from these explorations of other countries, I brought that information to a very important government insider who I had met in 2001, who was all about government transparency. John Podesta was President Clinton's chief of staff, and under Clinton, he was partly responsible for the release of many, many documents through the Freedom of Information Act.
I came into this really as an advocate of open government, more than I had thought a lot about UFOs or UAPs. They were a curiosity for me, really, but the two interests kind of married in 2001 when I met Leslie Kean.
I think it's time to open the books on the question of government investigations of UFOs. It's time to find out what the truth really is that's out there.
I think there has been fear that if the government ever tipped their hand to say, well, we have some phenomena and we don't know what it is, the public would just freak out. And I think quite the contrary. I think the public can handle the truth.
I would go to these countries and I put together information about how these agencies worked into a dossier. And I gave it to John Podesta.
You know, until the United States government joins and has their own official agency, like the French, like the British, like the people in Chile, the people in Peru, it kind of holds back the whole world.
In that dossier were 2 letters to John Podesta, specifically to him, one written by the head of the Chilean government agency studying UFOs, and one written by the head of the French agency, explaining why they felt it was absolutely crucial that the United States be involved if we're going to make any progress with this.
I think it's important for investigative journalists like Leslie Kean to keep pressing for answers. So I put my credibility on the line, and I supported her efforts to open the space for politicians to say it may be a question of national security. It is a question of aviation safety.
The event was such a success that Leslie Kean decided she should author a book with the aim of pulling all of this testimony together. And she had just the right contact to write the foreword for her. In 2010, Leslie Kean released UFOs, Generals, pilots, and government officials go on the record, with John Podesta writing the foreword. That meant that his name was plastered on the front of every copy of this book. A book where the main image on the front was the letters UFO. Once again, we have to be willing to sit with the data here. Whatever you might think of him in 2024, Podesta in the 90s and the 2000s was a UFO disclosure hero. No other global leader had the stones to put their name next to a confrontation with what was and is essentially a deep state. Whatever else you think of him, you've got to give him credit on this point. So what did he write in the foreword? Well, it's long, but here is a little quote that sums it up nicely. I'm skeptical about many things, including the notion that government always knows best, and that people can't be trusted with the truth. The time to pull the curtain back on this subject is long overdue. Presenting the facts, this book includes statements from only the most credible sources, those in a position to know about a fascinating phenomenon, the nature of which is yet to be determined. It's time to find out what the truth really is out there. The American people and people around the world want to know, and they can handle the truth. So nothing earth-shattering, just the same consistent message he's been pushing for nearly 2 decades at this point. But sometimes boring consistency is just the trick. And when you look at the long history of disclosure, this book holds a special place. Not only did it become a bestseller and provide a sense of legitimacy to a topic that desperately needed it, but it also represented the culmination of over a decade of thoughtful collaboration in the disclosure movement. This isn't just a book. It's a sign that the best that the disclosure movement had to offer were working in lockstep. And as we're about to see, they would continue to do so into the 2010s. When I initially started this project, I was actually in Sofia, the capital of Bulgaria, in 2023. I was sat in a restaurant looking out across the city at the Vitosha mountain which sits in the horizon, with just one key question on my mind. What really happened in 2016 and 2017 with UFO disclosure? When Tom DeLonge did all those interviews and when those WikiLeaks emails dropped, was that genuine activism? Was he being used for nefarious purposes? Or had he actually tapped into a process of true disclosure? The same with Lou Elizondo and Chris Mellon. Who were these people, and could I really trust them? If I could trust them, then what we were seeing happen in the UFO disclosure movement was truly astonishing and game-changing. But the same was true on the flip side. If it was actually all a game being played by nefarious actors, that would be equally fascinating. What were their purposes, and who are they? I finally decided it was time to start really trying to get to grips with these questions. And as part of that process, I started reviewing all the important interviews and created a timeline of events for the 2016 and 2017 disclosure process. And when I did, it became clear that everything traced back to one moment. Before the New York Times article in 2017, before To the Stars Academy of Arts and Sciences, before the emails leaked, and before Tom's podcasts and interviews, there was John Podesta's now infamous tweet on the 13th of February, 2015. Finally, my biggest failure of 2014, once again not securing the hashtag disclosure of the UFO files. Hashtag the truth is out there. As he left the Obama administration, this was his final message, and it stands out in the timeline as a peculiarity. Was this just Podesta expressing his frustrations at the past? Or did he know something that we didn't? Either way, the tweet created new discussions that are important for our purposes. Off the back of this tweet, our old friend Leslie Keane decided to write an article about Podesta and his long-standing activism on UFO disclosure. And in it, she would share something interesting. She writes, In 2011, Podesta hosted a private meeting of government officials, scientists, and military and intelligence experts, organized by Keane and her coalition at his liberal think tank, the Center for American Progress. A panel presented expert briefings backing the establishment of a modest official project to evaluate UAP in cooperation with other countries. This is really interesting. So here you've got a group of government officials, scientists, military and intelligence experts organized by Keane. Presumably, this is the same group of people who had featured in the 2007 hearings and in her 2010 book. So you've got the public press conference and book, and then you've got this private meeting that was hosted. But here is what is even more interesting to me. When Keane was writing this piece, she emailed John Podesta, and thanks to WikiLeaks, we have that email. And what she wrote to him and his staff is interesting. She said, jumping off of John's tweet, the one that we referenced a moment ago, a New York Times reporter that I know is writing an op-ed calling for the release of files and a new government project on UFOs. He has invited me to co-author. And here's the bit that's really interesting. It will include only things already public, like the CAP briefing in 2011, the forward to my book, and the foreign agencies. Isn't it interesting that she reassures Podesta that the article will only include things that are already in the public? It begs the question, what isn't public? What kind of activism would Podesta want to keep secret? Has he been doing things that the CIA, United States Air Force, and NASA wouldn't approve of? Bear in mind, Podesta already has quite the reputation at this point. He pushed the CIA from multiple angles in the Clinton administration. He pushed the United States Air Force to write and then rewrite a report on Roswell. He called up Area 51, and he and Clinton had even sent someone down there. He spoke for disclosure at 2 National Press Club events that were public. He wrote a foreword to the biggest UFO book at the time. And he stood with Keane against NASA, even though he didn't have to. He put his name next to Keane versus NASA, pro-disclosure, anti-secrecy. So if he's willing to do all of this, and for all of it to be extremely public, what on earth does he need to hide? Seriously, think about it. If you're willing to take such a strong stance against UFO secrecy and against specific agencies that clearly do not want to reveal something, but you're pushing on them again and again, what is it that you're doing in secret that you don't want them to know about? And remember, at this time, Podesta was leaving the Obama White House as a senior advisor to the president, so he was technically no longer in the administration. All of this begs the question, how much do we really know about Podesta's UFO activism? The truth is, you don't know what you don't know. Recently, at the Soul Foundation, Hal Puthoff made a really interesting comment that made me wonder just how many secret meetings Podesta had been a part of in DC.
Now, along the way, something that came across my path in this was that I was contacted by a CEO of a think tank in Washington, D.C. This is back a couple of decades ago. He says, I want you to come and participate in a conference here in Washington. I said, well, frankly, I'm too busy. What's it about? He says, I can't tell you what it's about, but if you come and you participate, you will consider it later to be one of the most important conferences you ever went to. Well, since I had respect for him and knew his background and many things he's done, I did finally decide to come to this conference. And when I arrived, there were about, 15, 20 people. I recognized some of them from the military, from CIA, DIA, some businessmen, and so on. So I thought, well, this is quite an interesting group of people. And so, to start the conference off, he said, this conference is about disclosing something to the American public. As a startup position, let's assume that there have been crash retrievals by Russia, China, and the United States. And the question is, can we bring this out to the public? And so I think I, and most of the people I knew, talked to them later, said, oh, this is really cool. I mean, this could really go someplace. So he said, okay, the strategy we're going to use is we're going to make a list of all the areas that you think would be affected by this. And then on each one, you're going to have to grade them on a scale from +9 to -9 as to the level of impact and whether it's positive or negative. Okay, so we started out by making lists. So we started out with the obvious things. Well, I mean, the stock market, maybe religions, well, certainly politics would be affected. So we made a long list. I mean, it was really a long list. And the time we got down to the bottom of the list, we were really in the weeds. Like, okay, if corporation A has access to retrieve materials that corporation B doesn't, then when this comes out, corporation B is going to sue corporation A, they're going to sue the government. This is really going to be a tough thing to kind of handle. So, okay. So anyway, we broke up into groups, each taking a certain number of the things that were in our list. Okay. And in my group, we added up the numbers, +9 to -9. And we ended up in the negative category, even though we were kind of positively disposed to the idea. So I thought, well, maybe that just has to do with the particular lists that we got. So then I talked to other people that were on other lists and said, you know, we came to a negative number also. Well, make a long story short, it turned out that everybody going through these lists, it was a very sophisticated situation with complex computers and big screens and all that kind of stuff. It finally came down to the fact that the problem was there's so many areas to handle, and there was no way to handle them all at the same time. And so the final result was, therefore, the leader said, we're going to recommend that we don't go forward with this. And so those of us who were participating in this were pretty disappointed, thinking, we started thinking that, this would be a good thing to do. So anyway, let's go forward up to, let's say, 2008.
The 20 years that Puthoff references would set you back to around 2004. And we know that Podesta founded and became CEO of CAP in 2003, putting this within reach. A tantalizing connection. But after reviewing Jacques Vallée's journals, it's evident that Puthoff actually attended a meeting at the Arlington Institute on the 6th of December 2005, a think tank in DC run by a different John Peterson, a former candidate to be the Secretary of the Navy, and at this point, one of the most respected futurists in the US. Although this isn't quite the data point I had initially got very excited about, it is actually still incredibly important. It's a reminder that multiple DC think tanks were actively discussing and plotting disclosure in the 2000s. And according to Vallée's journals, the think tank, and I quote, went much higher than Peterson and was organized under semi-official auspices. Personally, I would be surprised if Podesta wasn't actually at that panel, given that they were discussing the impact that UFO disclosure might have on society, and that Podesta was active in the DC area talking about exactly these topics. Now, about the Obama administration. Obama took office in early 2009, and right from the start, he had two of our favorite characters by his side. Hillary Clinton as his foreign secretary, basically a direct extension and representative of the president for foreign affairs and diplomacy, and John Podesta starting as chair of Obama's transition team and later as Obama's senior advisor. But really, what can we say about Obama on this issue? Well, we do have two interesting notes in the journals of Jacques Vallée. As the Obama administration began, the ORSAP project was struggling, not because it hadn't made progress, but because it was running out of funding and feared it might be shut down by other agencies. As a consequence, senior team members began looking to other departments and agencies to support possible funding. If you read Skinwalkers at the Pentagon, you will hear the story of how Lukatsky and Kelleher went to go and meet with Barry Hennessy at the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, Special Projects Division, the famous counterintelligence wing of the Air Force. And then they also headed to the DHS to see if they could find a new home and new funding for the program there. But in Jacques Vallée's journals, we also see that they approached Podesta. Vallée recounts, when he was asked to help with the project, John Podesta allegedly ran the other way, clearly eager to avoid the administration getting mixed up in ufology. I don't blame him, but I had been given the opposite impression of the man's intentions. Interesting. So Podesta is all UFO disclosure, but the moment he is associated with the presidency, he goes all sheepish again. And this fits in very well with what Leslie Kean has said in interviews, that while Podesta was a serious UFO disclosure activist, he drew a line between his private life and his role in an administration. It seems Podesta wanted to play it safe, even though he likely would have cared a great deal. And of course, this fits very well with what we saw in the first Clinton administration. Remember how Podesta and Bill Clinton had been incredibly active during the first term and suddenly went very quiet in the second term. Despite persistently going after the CIA and the United States Air Force, they suddenly stopped. And now, after 9 years away from the White House, being very public about UFO activism, he suddenly goes quiet again as soon as he enters the Obama administration. And then you see the tweet appears just as he leaves. I don't have any evidence that presidents and their staff are warned off of the subject, but I really do wonder. And perhaps this also explains why Kean was so careful to delineate between what was already known and potentially unknown secret efforts that may have occurred during the Obama administration. And we do know that there was some sort of conversation going on in the Obama White House. In 2022, John Greenwald submitted a FOIA to the Obama Presidential Library and found that they have, wait for it, 3,440 pages and 26,271 electronic files that reference UFOs, UAP, ATIP, and or ORSAP. And more than that, he was told that there is a further 5,196 electronic classified records that have been found pertaining to the same topics. Now, I'm not an expert on how documentation works in government, but that is over 30,000 pages, files, and classified records that have some connection to UFOs. That's about 10 per day in the Obama administration. It makes you wonder what was going on. I suspect that over the coming years, we might learn some pretty astonishing things when these files come out. Something worth considering here is whether the Obama administration may have come close to some kind of disclosure. I know that isn't something that people tend to entertain, but there is a curious data point we can lean on here, besides the sheer volume of UFO records from that era, and of course, the disclosure process that happened immediately after the administration. The data point I'm referencing is an interview that I've referenced in a previous video on Donald Trump, Hayam Eshed, and UFOs. Lou Elizondo has asked something very interesting on that UFO podcast. Here it is.
Every trip to DC is successful. It depends. It depends who we're engaging. There's always new information to be discussed, and new developments, and new incidents, new data. But then there's also the conversation of where do we go from here, right? And when people are having a healthy debate on what are the next steps, that's fantastic because that means people are thinking about the right things. As far as a almost moment, yeah, there's one in particular, but unfortunately, I'm not at liberty to discuss it yet. It occurred some time ago. Some colleagues were involved in it. There was a discussion by some very senior people in a former administration to potentially discuss disclosure. And for whatever reasons, it was decided later on not, maybe it wasn't time. I wasn't privy to that. I don't know all the details, and I certainly, it's preliminary right now for me to even comment on it. But there have been those moments where we've come very close to something, and for whatever reason, it was decided that maybe the timing wasn't right.
The implication here is that a move for disclosure nearly happened under a former administration, and that somehow Elizondo was in the inner circle of people who knew it might occur. I previously postulated that this was the Trump administration, given the surge of UFO activism in this era, and that Elizondo was very much in play in the world of UFO disclosure at this point. But it is also plausible that he could have been referencing the Obama administration. As far as we know, Elizondo was involved in UFO projects from 2007 to 2008 onwards, when he started doing counterintelligence for the ORSAT program. This makes it possible that he could be referencing an Obama effort, something that would line up well given the people who were surrounding Obama at the time. He had Hillary Clinton as his Secretary of State, John Podesta as a special advisor, and you just can't imagine a scenario where they wouldn't have spoken about this topic.
Hey guys, it's Jason here. I just wanted to quickly interject here. Whilst I was editing this video, I listened back to that Lou Elizondo clip and I just thought, how can I have been so stupid? It's totally plausible that that clip could be referencing an effort in the Trump administration. It could be referencing an effort in the Obama administration. Those are both legitimately, logically possible conclusions. But listening back to it now, having gone through this whole series, I'm more inclined to think that this is referencing something during the Clinton administrations, which we covered in the previous episode. Elizondo says this occurred some time ago. I don't want to overinterpret that, but that makes it sound like it was a decent amount of time ago. And he talks about how some colleagues were involved. Now, which colleagues were involved in the Clinton administration? Chris Mellon. And I think he was also doing SecDef stuff during Undersecretary of Defense stuff during the Bush years as well. Given what we've already concluded together about how Clinton and Podesta, were pushing disclosure so hard in that first administration and then suddenly stopped in 97. With all of that data, I'm way more inclined now to look back and to say some time ago, former colleagues were involved in a push for disclosure. And if there was anyone who was going to push for it, it would have been Clinton. So I think I'm gonna side with that. It's a real reminder not to allow the hypotheses that we are considering to drive our interpretation of the data. And I think I've been a little bit guilty of that here, hearing this clip and thinking this fits really well with what I'm currently thinking. This actually fits a lot better, I think, with the Clinton perspective. So apologies for that, but we keep learning together. And tell me, who do you think that Lou is referring to, or do you trust Lou at all? Thanks. Back to the clip. Back to the video. Back to the Faceless podcast.
It makes you reflect on the interview that Obama did with Jimmy Kimmel on the 13th of March, 2015.
So this is something I feel like, if I was the president, and it's unlikely that that is ever going to happen.
You never know.
If I was the president...
It was unlikely that I was going to be president.
The moment I was inaugurated, my hand would just, it'd still be hot from touching the Bible, and I would immediately race to wherever they have the files about Area 51 and the UFOs, and I'd go through everything to find out what happened.
Right.
Did you do that?
That's why you will not be president. Because that's the first thing that you would do.
It's at
the aliens won't let it happen. You reveal all their secrets. They exercise strict control over us.
Now, there are a lot of people that are going to examine your facial expressions here, every twitch, everything, and say, and of course, so did you look? Did you see? Did you explore?
I can't reveal anything.
Oh, really? because President Clinton said he did go right in and he did check and there was nothing.
Well, you know, that's what we're instructed to say.
We know from the leaked WikiLeaks emails that these interviews are always managed and that the questions are chosen ahead of time. So Obama decided to include the UFO topic just a month after Podesta's famous tweet. Interesting. And did you know that a year earlier, Bill Clinton did exactly the same thing on the 2nd of April, 2014?
When we come back, I hope you will indulge me in something, because I want to ask you about your access to the files on the UFOs, okay? President Clinton is here with us. We'll be right back. President Bill Clinton is here with us. So if I was president, and I won't be, let's be honest, the first thing I would do after putting my hand on that Bible and taking that oath to serve the country is I wouldn't even probably finish the oath. I would run to the White House. I'd demand to see all the classified files on the UFOs. Because I want to know. I'd want to know what has been going on. Did you do that?
Sort of.
Sort of.
Yeah, we had, I think it was at the beginning of my second term, we had the anniversary of Roswell.
You waited that long?
I did.
Wow.
Well, I didn't. And then there's also Area 51. You remember there was a great sci-fi movie where there was an alien kept deep under the ground in Area 51? So first I had people go look at the records on Area 51 to make sure there was no alien down there. And people thought that because everybody who works there has to stop about an hour away and put on special clothing and then drive in and out. And that's because a lot of our stealth technology is made there. We know that now, but there are no aliens there. So then when the Roswell thing came up, I knew we'd get, gazillions of letters. So I had all the Roswell papers reviewed, everything. Well, I think, look, what do we know? We know now we live in an ever-expanding universe. We know that there are billions of stars and planets literally out there, and the universe is getting bigger. We know from our fancy telescopes that just in the last 2 years, more than 20 planets have been identified outside our solar system that seem to be far enough away from their suns and dense enough that they might be able to support some form of life. So it makes it increasingly less likely that they might be able to support some form of life. So it makes it increasingly less likely that we're alone.
Oh, you're trying to give me a hint that there are aliens.
No, I'm trying to tell you I don't know.
Oh, you're trying to give me a hint that there are aliens.
No, I'm trying to tell you I don't know.
Oh.
But if we were visited someday, I wouldn't be surprised. I just hope that it's not like Independence Day.
Yeah, right.
That it's a conflict.
Well, now we have friendly
Maybe the only way to unite this incredibly divided world of ours. They're out there. We better think of how all the differences among people on Earth would seem small if we felt threatened by a space invader. That's the whole theory of independence.
You're right.
Everybody gets together and makes nice and,
It's all very interesting. And I'm not saying there's definitive proof that these interviews are part of a disclosure process, but it is interesting to ask, when did disclosure actually start? And the more I think about it, the more inclined I am to say that it started far earlier than we realize. As we reach our conclusion of this episode, and indeed of this 3-part series, that question I just asked about when disclosure actually started, it pulls us nicely back to the beginning of our entire dialogue. In part 1, we asked, what was it that led the Clintons and Podesta to push the UFO issue so hard in 2016? We know it wasn't just for laughs. So what did they know? As we got into episode 2, we realized that their activism actually traces its way all the way back to 1993, and that for 4 years, the Clintons and John Podesta pushed for UFO disclosure incredibly hard, far harder than anyone really realizes. Today, we've seen that at least for Podesta, that activism continued in a serious way through the Bush years with panels, books, and legal action against NASA. And in those years, clearly, a coalition of disclosure activists was building around Leslie Kean, James Fox, and Podesta, who was connected to this. Finally, with the Obama administration, these characters enter the White House again, and we see a surge in documentation, conversations, and even a briefing on the program. And then, as the Obama years end and Clinton begins her campaign, suddenly Clinton and Podesta are willing to take an enormous risk to talk up UFOs as part of their campaign process. So what can we make of this all? Well, my personal conclusion is this. At the very least, Podesta and Clinton decided that they wanted to push for disclosure. But I think it is far, far more likely that they were actually given permission. Not by the whole defense and intelligence community. That is an important distinction to make here. The truth is that the more you look into this topic, the more you recognize that the defense and intelligence community is divided and factionalized on this issue. Some people are pro-UFO disclosure and are pushing for it. Some people are very anti it. So it's not the whole defense and intelligence community that said, let's go for this. It was a portion of people who decided it was time, even though they knew there was another faction or perhaps multiple factions that were not in favor of this. Now, you'll remember in our first episode, we asked the question, is it possible that Neil McCasland, Robert Weiss, and General Michael Carey were the people who had given the Clintons and John Podesta permission to drive this disclosure process? It's a very reasonable question, but it seems that it's very unlikely that that is the case. And we cover this in episode 1, but I'm going to cover it here very quickly again, just because it's important for how we reach our conclusions. In 2016, Tom DeLonge organized a call between John Podesta and General Neil McCasland, General Michael Carey, and Robert Weiss. They were all on a call together. We have a good sense of what happened on this call because immediately afterwards, Tom sends an email to Podesta where he talks about General McCasland. And it reads, he mentioned he's a skeptic. He's not. I'd been working with him for 4 months. I just got done giving him a 4-hour presentation on the entire project a few weeks ago. Trust me, the advice is already happening on how to do all of this. He just has to say that out loud, but he is very, very aware, as he was in charge of all the stuff. When Roswell crashed, they shipped it to the laboratory at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. General McCasland was in charge of that exact laboratory up to a couple years ago. He not only knows what I'm trying to achieve, he helped me assemble my advisory team. He's a very important man. What this email tells us is that Tom's reading of this call was that McCasland and John Podesta hadn't actually met and hadn't exchanged information previously. That means that at the start of this call, it's very likely there wasn't a, oh, hi General McCasland, how are you doing? Yes, I'm very well, John, thank you. It's been a long time since we've seen each other, hasn't it? Yes, it has. It's good to see you again. There was none of this. Instead, the only thing that was happening was that Neil McCasland was actually saying he's a skeptic, which implies that McCasland didn't feel comfortable talking openly about this topic, even though he knows Robert Weiss, he knows Michael J. Carey, and of course he would have known that Podesta was involved in this issue, which is why they're having a conversation. Despite this, he continues to say that he's a skeptic. The implication of all of this, and perhaps I'm rambling a little bit here, but the implication of this is that Neil McCasland and John Podesta and these people had not met before, which is really important because McCasland, Robert Weiss, Michael Carey, the various people who we don't know who were associated with him, were absolutely driving for disclosure at this point. And we know this because of another previous email where General Neil McCasland had emailed Tom DeLonge, this was in September of 2015, with a proposal for what a presidential memorandum should look like. McCasland wrote up that when they get into office, Podesta and Clinton should put out a memorandum that talks about the need for NASA to run a project in coordination with the DoD, the DNI, and also the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Very interesting that he included them. They're the ones who are responsible for deep underwater ocean exploration, but that's an aside. This email that McCasland sent to Tom DeLonge which he then sent to Podesta, shows us that this other faction, which is distinct from the Clintons and Podesta, were also passionately and actively involved in this dialogue, thinking that something was coming in terms of the presidency. And yet, they hadn't spoken with John Podesta before. Now, I know I'm going very roundabout with this, and again, I'm rambling a little bit, but this is very important. Both of these groups, the Clintons and Podesta and their people, Neil McCaslin and his people, are both simultaneously invigorated in terms of UFO disclosure. And this gets me to the conclusion that I want to make. I think we can postulate that there is another group that caused both movements. In Tom's early interviews, he said some really interesting things about timing. Once he'd met with Robert Weiss and he'd met with him and a person from the CIA near the Pentagon, he then went straight to NASA, where he met with some people there. And when he did, the person that he met at NASA said something very interesting.
This has been going on for a long period of time, but for myself, I think it's the right time and place. I remember I was at NASA, and I was having a meeting with one of the top people there, one of the top 5 people there, and I made everyone leave the office, and I said, hey, I just want to let you know what I'm getting ready to do. And I laid out the entire plan. And this person looked at me, took a deep breath, and said, this is a very, very good time for this, or it's a very, very good time for this. And I remember that, just staring at this person going, okay, so something's already in the works, it seemed like to me, So I think what's happened, in my view, is that they've been dripping it along the way.
This interview clip and a few other ones that are peppered through the interviews with Tom DeLonge show us that something was already in the works. Now, I don't know exactly who the people were that were involved. I don't know how they operate. I have my speculations, and I will cover those in a future episode, but I won't state them here. But I do think that this deeper level of operation is the best way to understand what happened in 2016. Permission was given, and it must have been given by some very significant people. It was known in inner circles that Clinton would run in 2016 and that Podesta would be her campaign manager. And as we've seen in this 3-part series, anyone who was pushing UFO disclosure in the 20 years building up to this campaign would have known just how much Podesta and Clinton cared about this. They were passionate activists. I don't have to explain that again, right? And so the relevant people reached out to them when they knew they were going to run. And this is why Podesta suddenly called Tom back, saying, this is very important.
You've had very open communications with Podesta. His interest in this goes way, way back, as does hers.
Yeah, I think people need to take, very, very, very strong notice of what's going on when Hillary Clinton comes on the Jimmy Kimmel show like she did a couple nights ago and says, we are going to dig in and bring out the UFO files, quote, unless it has to do with national security. That was the one caveat. So she's saying this needs to come out, but there might be some things that's going to hold some of it back. And she's letting you know with breadcrumbs here that there are national security issues with this stuff. And there are global security issues with this stuff. So her campaign manager, John Podesta, is a very, very powerful and important person. And a lot of this audience knows of him because he tweeted a few times about UFOs. One of his famous tweets last year was that his biggest failure for 2014 was not getting the UFO files released. And he is in my docuseries. And he was, the story there was I reached out and I told him what I was trying to achieve with this project. And he was very quiet on the phone. He was listening, and I kind of went through what my objectives were. And I have my pitch down, but I'm speaking very respectfully, and I'm trying to lay out all the reasons why this needs to happen. But I didn't think that I really got through to him, and I didn't. For all I knew, he thought I was just some crazy rock star that wants to talk about something weird. But I knew he was into this stuff, but I just didn't know how much or whatever. So he said, call me in a couple months. I'm pretty busy, and we'll see where we're at. I was like, cool. I never called him back because I didn't think he was really, absorbing what I pitched him. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, I just get this flurry of emails from his office that he wants to be in this, and I have to come out to D.C., and it's a major priority, and the rest is history. But
essentially, in 2015, everything started to move together. And as Tom said when he was getting very enthusiastic in his interview with Jimmy Church,
we have Obama on Kimmel. We have Obama on Ellen. We have Hillary on Kimmel. We have Bill on Kimmel. Podesta with his famous tweet last year, and him pushing forward and his inquisitiveness about what's.
The answer is yes. The answer is yes. There's a reason. When you ask me about the candidates doing stuff like that, I know why. And and the reason is it's time.
So at the very least, we now know that people at NASA, at the very least at NASA, were already working on a disclosure project when Tom spoke to them. And actually, if you look at the drip of information coming from NASA at the time, it fits perfectly. February 26th, 2014, NASA announced the discovery of 715 new exoplanets discovered by the Kepler Space Telescope, many of which were in the habitable zone, the zone where life can thrive. April 7th, 2015, during a congressional hearing, Ellen Stoffen, then NASA's chief scientist, stated she believed that we would find strong indications of life beyond Earth within a decade, and definitive evidence within 20 to 30 years. September 28, 2015, NASA announced evidence of liquid water flowing intermittently on present-day Mars. This discovery was based on data from the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter, which detected hydrated salts on Martian slopes, where mysterious streaks were discovered. Remember, NASA was and is one of the most powerful, respected, and recognizable brands on the planet. So when they say this stuff, it actually does change the way that people think. And maybe this also lifts the lid on the Bill Clinton and Barack Obama interviews. Get the commander-in-chief talking openly about this subject, sparking curiosity and conversation. So when this NASA person says to Tom, this is a very good time for this, it kind of looks, when you look at the surrounding circumstantial data, it kind of looks like they are already busy trickling stuff out there and opening up the conversation. And when you grasp this, you realize, and this is a bit of a side point, you realize that what happened to Tom DeLonge isn't black and white in the way that the UFO community sometimes likes to dichotomize. He just met the right people at the right time. He could genuinely say, I was the front man of the biggest band in the world. I think Blink's self-titled album was pretty good. Other than that, I'm not really a big fan, but arguably they were a huge band with a global presence. And he dropped out to start talking about the truth of UFOs and the complexity of the government's role in handling the issue. And of course, they're going to think, well, we're already trying to open up this conversation. This incredibly influential person is here. Well, of course, they were going to try and use his platform to enhance what they were already doing. Now, answer this question. If those people knew that Clinton was going to run with Podesta as her campaign manager, and they saw the initial polls that were immensely favorable to a Clinton presidency, and of course they knew the history of the Clintons and Podesta and the same history that we charted across this series, would they reach out ahead of time? I think the answer is obvious. Of course they would. Of course they would. And once again, as I've explained in the last couple of episodes, I'm not saying Clintons and Podesta good, Trump bad. I think the reality of this is far too complicated for that. I think if we knew the whole truth about what the Clintons and Podesta have done, I'm pretty certain we would see some shocking crimes that would disqualify them from holding public office. That's my personal conviction. But I also think that even corrupt people can be fascinated by secrets that are being withheld from them. Everybody is curious, right? And if you become the commander-in-chief and you're denied the real truth about what is likely the biggest secret of all time, wouldn't you remain simultaneously frustrated and curious? I would. No matter how corrupt I was, I would still think I want to know. And I think you can read this on Clinton's face and in his voice when he says,
If the United States Air Force did recover alien bodies, they didn't tell me about it either. And I want to know. I want to know. I want to know.
You can be corrupt and be fascinated by the truth. Of course you can. Everybody wants to know what's behind the curtain. Everyone. And with that said, here's a thought. Isn't it weird that this, the 2016 election, and all it represented for disclosure, was the moment that the biggest upset in US political history occurred? That's not a statement by me. I'm not saying that there's a there. It represents a genuine question that I think we should dig into more. Now, there's so much more that we have to cover. Firstly, why was 2016 the right year for this to really start pushing forwards? What dictates the timeline? Second, who were the advocates for disclosure, the people behind both of these factions who triggered all of this activity? And most interestingly, who were the advocates of secrecy and how have they operated? Well, this three-part series has laid the groundwork to finally answer these fascinating questions. And to do so, I'm now going to begin embarking on another multi-part series, this time an even more ambitious one. And I'm extremely excited about it. But for now, this will mark the end of our initial investigation into the Clintons, Podesta, and UFOs. Thank you very much for joining me in this multi-part series. It's been an absolute pleasure. As I mentioned in this episode, this all started nearly a year and a half ago now, when I realized I really need to start asking questions to work out, for my own sake, who should I believe? Can I trust this sort of Lou Elizondo, Chris Mellon movement that's begun? And I'm sure you can sense from the direction this series has ended up going in that I personally think that we can. And the reason for that is that when you chart all of this history, it's really hard to fake activism. It's really hard to fake a genuine desire to get to the bottom of an issue. It's really hard to say that this is just a psyop from the Clintons and from Podesta and the people associated with them when you dig through all of this stuff. It's just too complicated. In the same way that you can say the reality of the UFO phenomenon can be confirmed, because at this point, we're talking about 100 years, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of individual events. Having a conspiracy to create a fake phenomenon so that you could reach some sort of ambiguous political climax that's supposedly happening right now, it's just really hard to put that theory together. And if it is a psyop, I am happy to fall for it. I really, really am. But I think it's similar in this case. Eventually, you have to settle down and say, you can't fake this. Again, I'm not saying that the Clintons and Podesta are good people and that their motivations are good. I'm saying that this disclosure process, this attempt to open up this topic, does represent an attempt to reveal the truth of the situation. And in this new series that I'll be making, we'll be showing this even more by examining the factional conflict that's been occurring between this faction that we've been exploring over these last sessions and also the other faction that's obscured in the darkness. But more of that to come later. For now, my name's Jason Somoza, and thank you very much for listening to this final episode in this series. Please leave your comments, and I'm grateful for all of you and for this journey that we're all on. It's great to be a part of it. Thank you, and have a good day.